All right. Well, we're 7:31, and we all have to go to the operating room around 8:30. So we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining. And again, our ground rounds for the fall and the start of the academic year in 2021. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Vicki LeBlanc, who's going to be our guest speaker today, who's going to talk about stress in the operating room and stress around surgery and stress on surgeons and the impact that they might have on ourselves and on our patients and our trainees as well. Vicki is a experimental psychologist by training. She had her PhD at McMaster in 2001. She then went on to the Wilson Center at the University of Toronto and rose as an associate director of that center. The center is also, for those who may not know, where Richard Resnick made his great impact, as well as Brian Hodges, who eventually